land is my land, from California to the New York Island, from the Redwood Forest to the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me.
Hello, I'm John Grom, and this is the 28th Right and Left Discussion Forum, where we discuss the issues of the day in a civil and respectful manner. Our purpose is not to avoid disagreement, but to listen to and examine others' opinions with a view to finding common ground. Knowing that partisan conflict makes matters of all kinds worse, the rational people turn to reason, logic, and civility to find solutions. Today we're going to discuss the various aspects of the proposed pipeline running from the Canadian border to Steel City on the southern border of Nebraska. The project is known as the Keystone XL Phase 4. Our panel today, starting on my left, is Dr. Ronald Chamberlin, retired senior research chemist. On his left is Patty Haskins, retired high school math teacher and Democratic member of the Wadsworth City Council. On her left is Tim Burns, the retired teacher and manager of adult services at the Twinsburg Library. Ron, over the last 5 years, a mostly uncivil debate has been going on between the oil companies, the environmental groups, labor unions, politicians, and media pundits over the wisdom of the construction of the final phase of the Keystone XL pipeline. What are your thoughts, Ron?
John, the more I looked into this, the more deeply multi-layered and confusing it became. But I'm going to try to, with your permission, to be a little professorial here and try to summarize some of the major aspects of this. Now, a little bit about my background. My career was in electrochemistry. However, I spent about 20 years of that working on the energy transfer devices, conversion devices known as fuel cells. That includes my PhD research. I graduated from Pennsylvania State University from the Department of the College of Mineral Industries from the Department of Fuel Science. So I was exposed to a great deal of the technology and the economics and of the various kinds of extraction and so forth. Now, TransCanada likes to call their deposits oil sands, but they're tar sands. The material there is bitumen. B-I-T-U-M-E-N, a very thick, heavy, viscous, non-flowing substance, tar, kind of thing that trapped the mastodons in California, maybe a little thicker. So there are a couple of ways of getting that out. There are three major deposits of this. Two of them are deeper deposits which require drilling. One of the larger ones is a surface deposit, which basically strip mining we moved out. Now, in all cases, particularly in the deep mine extraction, you have to put something in there to liquefy and it could be steam, it could be solvents. Once it's brought out, then it has to be somewhat refined in order to break it down somewhat. They make synthetic crude, and they make another substance which is a little more freely flowing. It requires 3 to 4 gallons of fresh water per gallon of oil produced. That comes out of the Athabasca River and goes back to unlined, not well supervised tailing ponds. Looks like the surface of the moon up there if the moon had water. That material is leaching into the rivers and that sort of thing. So there's a couple of different aspects, many different aspects here. There's the technology. Describe that. It requires a great deal of fresh water, probably equivalent to the kind of fracking controversy we're having now. It's using water that isn't going to be reclaimed. It's that water is going into places where it's influencing the environment in very negative ways. It's an environmental disaster for what it is. It makes 12 to 17% higher greenhouse gas emissions from this than it does from other things. It can be leaking into the aquifer.
From other crude grades.
Than other things. Now, part of the controversy coming through the United States, particularly Nebraska and the Sandhills region, where was that it might go into that sensitive environmental area, and it's over the Ogallala Aquifer, which supplies fresh water for many thousands of people. That's been moved a little bit. It's being held up by various administrative details in Nebraska at this point. But there was a retired professor with expertise in this matter who made extensive interviews to TransCanada, and he became convinced that if there were leaks in this pipeline, it's a buried pipeline, a minimum of 4 feet of cover over it, that it would be extremely localized and very unlikely to actually make it into the aquifer. It is a very well monitored pipeline. They say that within this pressure monitors 50 or so throughout the length of the pipeline, it could be cut off within about 15 minutes, continually monitored. Now, it affects a great deal of Canada's boreal forest, which is a great source of carbon sink and a formation of oxygen for the company. However, again, TransCanada says that this affects only 1/10% of the boreal forest, both in the area they're using and the area that the pipelines will go through. It's only 1/10% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. And it's U.S. coal plants generate 40 times the amount of greenhouse gases. In fact, pointed out that the state of Wisconsin alone produces as much as these will generate, including the burning of it, of course. So there are conflicts of interest here in the reporting. Politically, Nebraska's been reported that TransCanada has done some threats to local landowners. They won't let them go through. They're going to get eminent domain, that sort of thing goes on. Geopolitical. Well, TransCanada says, well, you're going to buy it from us, you're going to buy it from Venezuela or Saudi Arabia or someplace else. Political, well, Democrats particularly are concerned that even though this crude gets to Texas, to Port Arthur and to Houston, some of us probably not going to come to this country anyway. Now, with the U.S. dragging its feet, again, the sort of geopolitics here, Canada is looking into at least 2 northern routes for the passageway where it'll go to the ocean and be put on tankers and taken away that way. And I saw a brief mention, I wasn't able to find it again, that it might utilize some of the existing pipelines going all the way to Maine. Imagine the furor that's going to cause. So there's that. Indigenous peoples. The pipeline and the processing and the water is impacting the territories, the treaty lands of the First Nations peoples and the American Indians. As disruption, fears for the health, fears in case there are groundwater contaminations and that sort of thing. So there are economics. It's very complex. Jobs. Well, some people say, oh, it's going to create hundreds of thousands of jobs. Others say it's going to create none. Well, there was a U.S. government agency, Department of the Labor perhaps, that looked into this, and they calculated that it's going to create for 2 years 1,950 jobs. At the end of that time, the end of the construction, 50 jobs. 50. Not a big impact. So there'll be a lot of disruption during the construction and so forth. The state of Kansas has given the TransCanada an exemption from property taxes. They stand to lose $50 million for 10 years per year.
Every year?
Every year.
Wow.
So, this is going to be a big deal here, so should we do this? Safety. Well, let's assume that Canada is not going to say, well, Canada doesn't have a great record in environmental safety. I recall many years ago now visiting the Algonquin Provincial Park, which is about 150 miles north of Toronto. That is downwind of the Sudbury zinc mining operation. There were a number of lakes in that area which were practically lifeless because they were so acidified by the fallout from that plant. So Canada doesn't have any better record than we do on environmental issues. Safety, let's assume that they go ahead and do it. We don't have that pipeline. We have to ship it by rail. That's a much less good safety record. By rail, we've had two tragedies this year
Sure.
where tank cars have gone. So, many things. It might improve U.S. energy security if we get it. It can cause it has aspects for global warming, whether you believe in that or not. But CO2, it is generating some issues on that. It may be more, it may be less. Very complex issue. As an environmentalist, I don't think that even if it does make a small amount, if it just is a hangnail on the whole body, doesn't mean you should tolerate it.
Patty, the EPA put out a report, and they made reference to the environmental impact statement made by the State Department, where they said this project will have no impact at all on the environment. And their reasoning was that the Canadians are going to find a market for this oil somehow, whether it's marketed to the United States or someplace else. But the EPA, the federal government's official stand is that this is environmentally neutral. What do you think?
It depends on what study you look at. There have been many out there.
Well, I'm talking about the one by the EPA.
And the EPA has come out. I think some of the concerns, and one interesting fact that I found, and I was surprised by it, is 65% of the country is in favor of this. 51% of Democrats are in favor of it. So it's not necessarily an issue that just Republicans are in favor of it. Obviously, the environmentalists are not. Part of the problem originally arose, and I think some of the concern was that one of the original environmental watchers that did a study on this, it was claimed that it was not. It was a bias study because that company had strong ties to TransCanada, who owned the pipeline. So it was put out there that this can't possibly be true. Now that has been debunked since then because of studies like the one that you mentioned. Yes, it will increase greenhouse gases, but as Ron stated, coal is much worse and produces more. If you transport it by tanker, as opposed to doing it through this pipeline, there is greater damage and risk to the environment than if it were done by this manner. And I think that's part of the neutral effect that they're looking at. It does, however, I mean, we are looking in this country for, clean energy, and it is still not clean energy. There are a number of side effects, one of which is where it's going, I believe, is a seismic zone, and there is some concern about the disruption in that area, that could possibly affect that. But it still is a lot cleaner than coal. I think some of the apprehension and some of the pro is because when this was originally started, there was so much misinformation out there. So much misinformation. The job situation. I mean, it was originally reported hundreds of thousands of jobs, and I heard this on many broadcasts. Then it was down to like 20,000. And I've seen that it could maybe temporary jobs, a couple of thousand, but the most generous figure I saw as far as permanent jobs was 50 to 100, but more likely less than 50 permanent jobs. So this is not a job creator in the country. So that kind of, you see that and you say, oh gee, they were wrong about that. What else are they wrong about? There were also the concerns that a good portion of this will not be used in the United States. It's going to get shipped out to China, wherever, after it gets to the Gulf. So it's not going to help the crisis that we have in trying to do independence of our own fuel and energy. So, one of the comments I also saw, there were concerns, and I think because Koch Industries were considered to be the big winners in this. And of course,
Who was that? I'm sorry.
the Koch brothers.
Oh, okay.
Who, of course, have a lot of money invested in Republican politics. And I think some people see that name and they automatically raise their eyebrows and so forth. And they've done some of the purchasing of the land and the rights here in the United States. Ron mentioned eminent domain. I think that's where I might have a problem, because they have already taken a great deal of land by eminent domain. And while sometimes necessary, isn't there, you try to look for another route to go. I know when I started looking into this, I was very opposed to it, and I'd heard all the environmental problems, and then I read studies like you just mentioned, and I thought, oh, I might have a little difference of opinion on this, that perhaps this is a safer way to handle this situation. Still problems, but nothing's perfect, I guess.
Tim, I know that you've been doing some homework on this subject. Have you come up with some conclusions?
What they said. You know, there's so many things went through my mind. One of them is something that I do from time to time is does it pass the playground test? And these are things that when kids on the playground do things, the teacher will say, no, 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 you can't do that. You know, this is not right. One of them is, well, you know, the Canadians are going to send it over there anyways. So that's not a good reason. You know, that doesn't pass the playground test that we should be doing it. Having said that, this is going to happen. It's just too much money. None of this is going to benefit in all the ways they say it's going to benefit. But I was shocked, like maybe other people who would search through this, to find out that it's almost a fait accompli. There's one section, and it's a new section. I mean, it goes all the way to Oklahoma anyways. And so this is, I mean, I was surprised at so many parts of this. But the other thing is that why we're dealing with last century. This is not a 21st century issue. This is a 20th century issue. We're talking about fossil fuels. You and I have talked before about trying to get relevant, intelligent, credible opponents to climate change. I was trying to do a debate. There's nobody there. I mean, I know there are politicians who make comments, but credible scientific people, it's almost everybody understands there's climate change. So why are we doing this? It seems to me that if you want to use the argument of jobs, the infrastructure of the United States, the whole United States is going to definitely put hundreds of thousands of people to work continuously. And I know it's expensive, but that is something we actually need. And it's going to, you know, turn around. People who are working are going to spend money. I keep thinking that when I was newly arrived in Ohio, driving to Cleveland, going past Brook Park, and every 24 hours a day, that whole parking lot was filled. And knowing that friends of mine, whose parents were of the greatest generation.
Excuse me, this is a Ford plant?
Yeah, the Ford plant there at Brook Park. They were all going on vacations. You know, I grew up in the military. Our vacation was moving from one place to another. But it was like they were going to the lake. They had boats. They had campers. And I thought, I mean, I didn't think at the time, but later I thought, my gosh, they must have spent a lot of money. They made the money. They spent the money. Their houses were small and modest. But that, to me, is like the economic engine, you know. And we seem to have put everything. We look at everything about this far away from our hand, you know.
Yeah.
Boom. Instead of what's the long-range plan? I mean, I read some not EPA, but some environmental things that were said, and I'm sure they were hyperbolic, but you may never get it back. I mean, this may be a tipping point. You know, I'm sure there's many tipping points. West Virginia's water was a tipping point, you know, when they just had that. But we may already be at that point, and already we're going to talk about, like was mentioned, the kind of oil this is. This is terrible. I mean, it's not as good as, you know, and of course Canada wants it. I mean, my gosh, the jobs are exploding in there. Another little thing that Montana was recently, I think it was the happiest state because of the high employment due to their new sand tar or whatever they're doing in their oil thing. So it's like, you know, there is some happiness to this, but I don't know, it just really depressed me about the whole concept.
Yeah. I think one of the things that concerns me, basically being more or less obsessed with the issue, of civil discourse and truth and so forth is that this has been a great job creator for the perception managers of the world. That when you go through and read the reports that come from the Petroleum Institute and compare them to the reports that you're seeing from different environmentalist groups, it's hard to believe that you're looking at the same topic.
Right.
And that these interest groups have retained perception managers to create their own version of the truth. And we're kind of stuck in this. We are handled, we are manipulated as a part of the American public on practically every issue. And that in this case, I noted some of the conflicting information coming out. Job creation, for instance, we've talked about that. The oil industry, or the National Petroleum Industry, put out a report, and they're ranging the temporary jobs anywhere from 20 to 42,000. And that it's going to create, in the short term, 108,000 full-time jobs, and over a period of 10 to 15 years, 500,000 full-time jobs. Now, think about those numbers when you hear this. The environmental groups, Sierra Club, the National Wildlife Federation, they're saying 3,900 temporary jobs and 35 full-time jobs. 50 was at a stretch that you came up with, but they came up with 35. Now the EPA report I was looking at, they were silent on the issue of employment. They didn't talk about it at all. But you look at the length of the pipeline. The length, now we're only talking about phase 4. The temporary thing, it goes from what Hardesty, well actually that part in Canada, that's their, our situation is from the Canadian border to Steel City, Nebraska. And it goes through Montana, a corner of South Dakota, the full length of Nebraska, because Steel City is at the southern edge. All right, so that's a total of 1,179 miles. And when you look at the environmentalist report, they're saying it's over 2,000 miles long, and it goes through 6 states.
I got 2151.
Yeah, well, that's going from Canada to Houston, or to the Gulf.
Yeah.
But we're only talking about phase 4 here, and it's 1,179
I think part
miles.
of that is that the total flow then will increase drastically, over 1 million gallons a day.
Yeah.
To the
See, there's another one. I got 850,000
Yeah, well,
barrels,
I got
not
different
barrels,
numbers,
not
everything
barrels.
I looked at.
But the question about where is the market for the oil that comes through, the environmentalists say, well, it's going to go to international markets. It's not even going to benefit the United States. The oil industry said, no, all domestic. My point is, we are so handled by the information. And I'm enough of a cynic to think in terms of following the money. And that who is benefiting? The oil industry, obviously, and for obvious reasons. But what about the environmentalist groups? They have tremendous resources to try to maintain, and they need revenue. And an issue like this is a great fundraiser. And that, of course, they're going to exaggerate it as far as they can. You know, we have an obsession with fear in this country anyway. And that the more afraid you can make us, the more money you can generate on some other group to do. So I'm concerned about the fact that I never thought I would say this, Ron. I never thought I would say this, but I've got faith in the EPA's report more than any of the others that are in there. And
You know, you also have countries like Venezuela who don't want it to go in because it could affect the amount that you go in. And you know, as far as the jobs thing, a lot of those numbers, it depends on whether you're talking about direct jobs or indirect jobs. Because in some of those inflated numbers, I'm not sure that they're lying. What they're including are restaurant owners and movie theaters and hotels where the workers may stay, and they think that will be more jobs. So
I saw a comment about Port Arthur, Texas, where this would go in. It says, yeah, the oil companies, refineries are booming down there, but the city's a disaster zone. So there's one. They mentioned it. Yeah, there's one club in town that has live music.
One of the interesting, as ancillary of this all, about how things go through and you think they're going to be really good for something, I came across the number of small cities in Ohio that gave tax abatement. It was a big thing with schools because they sometimes weren't even in the discussion. The village council, the small town council would do the negotiations, and they would give them a tax abatement for so many years in return for jobs. And so they would sign these agreements. But over a period of years, they found that they never followed up to see if the companies actually provided
Yes.
the jobs. There was no oversight that you would have thought would have been obvious, and they still maintain their tax abatement.
We have that oversight in Wadsworth, by the way. We definitely do.
And that there have been too many cases where as soon as the abatements,
The company moves out.
the company moved to
Sure.
someplace else.
Yeah.
I think that Walmart is famous for replacing a building every 10 years. Now, the one that we've got in Wadsworth, who knows how long it's going to be before they move out to Wadsworth Crossing. And
The city
close
just,
them.
as a matter of fact, we just
Yeah.
did a deal with one company, but it's, the way it is set up, if they do not provide the jobs, they're saying that we get that money back from them.
Is that right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so that's the way the deal was structured.
That's good.
Well, I think that we're probably going to have to tackle this in a future discussion about how much that we are at the mercy of the spinmeisters and the perception managers, and that we really have to recognize that once we've said our opinion about something, we're going to latch onto those things that reinforce it. And too many times we develop this impenetrable paradigm that we will not listen to anything that disagrees. And we were talking about the global warming issue, and that gets so complicated because people misunderstand. Yeah, there's global warming, but is it all caused by man-made CO2? Because that's where we want to spend the money. But in any event.
Another topic, another day.
Yes, thank you very much for this one. And I wanted to make a brief mention. There's a new restaurant in Worcester, Ohio, in Liberty called the First Amendment Public House. And one Thursday a month, they have debates like this.
Oh my God.
So I just
Interesting.
wanted to mention that. But anyway, I'd like to leave you with this thought. And I love this thought. Between the right and the left, there is a peaceful field. When people of goodwill meet there, almost anything is possible. Thank you very much for joining us.